Thank you again, Bill, very much. The time is short, and so that leads into what I want to talk about tonight, which is Israel and prophecy, probably my favorite subject. When people ask me what is, the biggest thing in prophecy today, Israel will always be number one. But I think there are twin issues in general, is Israel and the apostasy in church, which we talked about today. But tonight I've looked forward to because there are a lot of really interesting topics under the umbrella of Bible prophecy, and most of them legitimate. But one of the things I've started doing the last few years is thinking about how prophecy is applicable to our lives. What does it really mean if predictive prophecy is in the Bible, and what is it really for? Okay, it's still up there. Remember, I think it was 1969. Famous Time magazine cover story is God Dead, which sort of was in the air at that time. A really tumultuous decade, of course, but what an idiotic question, really, when you consider that God has provided plenty of proof that He's not only not dead, but actively engaged in the world. And it's clearly obvious. See, that's the thing. It's not like you have to analyze it for a long time and hunt for hidden truths and hidden meanings and hidden codes in the Bible and all this kind of stuff. Plainly obvious. And that's why I think that it is, in a lot of ways, prophecy is personal, because it's for you. It's for every individual. And through it, people can find God. Ironically, as I mentioned this morning, this question, is God dead, is not one that the church today seems equipped to answer. There are plenty of instances where they can't answer that question for whatever reason, or they don't answer it, whether it comes from young people or someone older. But in particular, we're failing millennials in a huge way. And the one subject that a lot of ministries and churches will avoid like the plague is predictive prophecy. Isn't that interesting? They don't want to talk about it. It's too controversial, they say. It's just for weird people to get into. Maybe that's true. But there are all sorts of reasons why they avoid it. And they do so at their own peril, but really shortchanging their congregations in a big way. Of the new breed of what I would call celebrity pastors in this country, the only one that I'm aware of that's touched on this subject in a positive way in the last few years is Craig Groeschel, Life Church in Edmond, Oklahoma, one of the big mega churches in the country. I would not agree with Craig Groeschel on a lot of things, but a few years ago he did do a 3-part series called The End. And it sounded like a straightforward dispensational presentation that I heard growing up. So kudos to him for doing that. But again, in an era when a lot of these ministries are looking for ways to evangelize and that sort of thing, they leave prophecy alone, and I'm mystified by that, really. Prophecy is one of the great evangelistic tools available to us today, without question. And I suspect that back of a lot of it is something that is sad to contemplate, but a common denominator that I've found over the years, and I've advocated for Israel for 20 plus years, when I talk to somebody, especially a leader in the church, about Israel and the Jews and that sort of thing, what I find is that they don't really like Jews. That's the root of it. They do not like Jewish people. Either they've bought into the stereotypes that Jews finance and control wars and all that nonsense, or they've had some bad personal experience with a Jewish person, which, you can have a bad experience with anybody. But it's always the Jew that's in the dock, always on trial. I actually think this wasn't in the presentation, but I think that goes back to in Genesis 3:15, where God tells Adam and Eve and the serpent exactly what's going to happen. And he tells us that salvation shall come from a particular place. And so if the Bible and our knowledge of God comes from the Jewish people, all the authors of the Bible were Jews, took place in Israel, didn't take place in Palestine, by the way, then shouldn't the Jewish people be warmly received by us? They should be, but they're not. I have a lot of Jewish friends. I have a lot of Israeli friends. To paraphrase Will Rogers, I never met a Jew I didn't like. Not once. They're a noble people. And so, to me, a lot of this begins way back in Deuteronomy. Some of the Old Testament books get a bad rap for being boring. They're anything but boring. And if you read Deuteronomy chapter 30, it's absolutely fascinating, because God is speaking to the Jewish people under the direction of Moses in the wilderness, right? 3,700 years ago, he gives them the whole sweep of Jewish history. He tells them exactly what's going to happen. And it's not ambiguous. He tells them, I'm going to do this, and then you're going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. You are going to rebel. I am going to expel you from the land I gave your forefathers, but, see, it's always that but with God that's our out if you turn to him. He said after, the Bible actually is really cool the way it puts it, after many days, and it's been many days, I will return you to the land of your forefathers. It seems obvious to me that this is spectacular, but it's lost on a lot of people. Do you know how many ancient peoples have been returned to their ancient homeland in history? Only one, the Jews. All the other ones are gone, and they're gone for good. They're under sand dunes in the Middle East, or they're lost to history. Here he tells them what's going to happen. Now, there are many, many passages in the Old Testament that speak to this. This is one of the dominant themes of Scripture, is the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral land. But you might be shocked at how many people hate that reality. Okay? From seminary professors all the way to the PLO. PLO-PA, Palestinian Authority, the same terrorist group that's always been. They want to deny Jewish history. And there is an effort that has been underway for a long time to deny and erase Jewish history. But it's clearly obvious. In the late 19th century, the first wave of large-scale Jewish immigration came to Palestine. And it was called Palestine from the 2nd century to 1948. So it is historically correct to say that they returned to Palestine. The land was largely empty. Now, of course, the Arabs dispute that completely. That's one of the many unresolved issues between them and everybody else. They claim that no, there was a a thriving Arab population there and that sort of thing. Historically, that can't be documented. So the land was largely empty. See the image on the left, that's the old city of Jerusalem, which at the time, of course, was all there was to the city of Jerusalem. It was as it was in biblical times, really. The image on the left, though, of course, is a modern picture. I've studied this stuff for 25 years, and it thrills my soul to know that the Jews have returned to their ancestral land. They've come back. And every single time I talk to a Jewish person, seriously, even a mundane conversation, the hairs raises up on the back of my neck. These people are miraculous. But they're miraculous for only one reason. God said so.
That's right.
Period. That's it. The same thing can apply for how we're supposed to live our life according to Scripture. God said so. Now, that's mocked by academics and those in the Christian community today who caution us to be careful thinkers. When you hear somebody say you should be a careful thinker, that means don't believe this mythology from the Bible. Can't believe in these Bible stories anymore. You've got to be sophisticated and modern. That's why things like the Exodus are denied, even in our seminaries. Can you believe that? In our seminaries, they teach people that the Exodus never occurred. One of my favorite verses of Scripture, and I love the Old Testament. A lot of people will tell you that it's out of date, it's not applicable for us today. That couldn't be more wrong. And by the way, bad things happen when people minimize Jewish history. When they minimize the Old Testament, bad things happen. The German Christian movement, so-called, in the lead up to the Nazis, decided to stop teaching the Old Testament in German churches. And we know where that led. Because if the Jews aren't God's chosen people, you can make them into anything you want them to be, including subhuman. But, as he always does, because he's unchanging, God tells us exactly how it is. And as I said this morning, a lot of people chafe at the rule giver God, the God who tells us what to do, and that sort of thing. I love it. Thank you, please. Help me. You know, I can't do it myself. How more wonderful can it be that our Creator knows us as individuals and He does all that He pleases? He says in Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, "Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else." I am God and there is none like me. And listen to this, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, "My counsel shall stand, I will do all my pleasure." That goes for periods in history, nations, kings, and the common everyday person. Only God knows the end from the beginning. Only God knows your end from your beginning. This is something we should be teaching young people, right? But we don't. Mark Twain, I think the greatest English writer of all time. Maybe the second greatest writer of all time after Isaiah. Wasn't a Bible guy, but he read the Bible and he could plainly understand it. He could understand English, you know. And if you can understand English, you can know God if you read Scripture. Not complicated. It's really not. God tells us what reality is. And Twain visited Palestine in 1868. And he said there is not a solitary village throughout its whole extent, not for 30 miles in either direction. There are 2 or 3 small clusters of Bedouin tents, but not a single permanent habitation. One may ride 10 miles hereabouts and not see 10 human beings. Palestine sits in sackcloth and ashes, desolate and unlovely, which was part of the punishment. That was part of the expulsion. Not only emptied of its people, but, as Twain says, it will lie desolate. Scripture tells us that. Again, God told us exactly what was going to happen. I took this picture a few years ago. It's in a neighborhood in Jerusalem called Yemen Moshe. And by the way, probably the priciest real estate in the world. It sits on the slopes across from the old city, across from Jaffa Gate. And the homes are beautiful. Plants, greenery, colors. There are places like this all over the country. Doesn't that blow your mind? It blows my mind. First time I ever visited Israel was almost exactly 20 years ago. So on the cab ride from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, of course I'm looking at everything and I'm thinking about all the spectacular sights I'm going to see. You know how they say where Jesus walked? But all of a sudden, we're passing hill after hill with these clusters of white stucco homes with red tile roofs. And then it hit me. I'm looking at prophecy fulfilled, because Jews live in those homes. Thousands of them. So, a common thing, a house, blew my mind. I live in the period of time when the Jews have re-entered history? Can there be anything more astonishing? And I want you to remember something, and I'm going to talk about this later. One of the things that I tell people when I give these presentations is, if you're up against it in your life over something, and you wonder if God is there or if He cares about you, I want you to remember, you live in the moment in which the Jews re-entered history. And if He can preserve an entire people through a worldwide dispersion for 2,000 years, He can handle your problems. Twain said something else one time I've never forgotten. He understood the implications of this stuff. And even though the Jews hadn't really returned in the time that he was visiting there, he did know about the prophecies of the return. And Twain said, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. And they ought not even be thought of. But they are thought of. He said the Babylonian, the Egyptian, the Greeks rose and made a great noise. They sit in twilight now. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was. What is the secret to his immortality? You know what the secret is. I suspect Twain knew it too, although he identified, I think, as an agnostic. Plainly obvious what is the secret to the Jews' immortality. Creator of the universe. If you don't like that, take it up with Him. Isaiah 35, 1 and 2. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given unto it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. The prophet is speaking of a time 2,700 years ago, about a time in the future when the Jews would return and they would reclaim the land, not just physically live there, but bring it back to its former glory. When Twain visited 150 years ago, it was a moonscape. It was a barren land that was desolate and unlovely. And today, you can drive through the whole country in really just a few hours. But you will see lush landscape that will take your breath away. The Galilee is like the Garden of Eden. Do you know? Because of Israeli ingenuity, there are palm groves growing at the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea. It looks like the moon. Barren Judean hills that have been that way for 2,000 years, but the Jews are reclaiming it. Palm groves at the Dead Sea. I was driving down there one day to go to Masada. I almost ran off the road. I saw these palms, green palms everywhere. Incredible. Why do you think they're there? They're there for one reason, and one reason only. God said it would be so. Period. This isn't complicated. It's also the definitive answer to the critics. Please, I invite you, ask somebody sometime who mocks predictive prophecy, who thinks that the Jews in the land are an accident, an historical accident. Please ask them to explain all this. I've asked many well-known critics of Israel in the church to explain things like this. Not one of them ever has. Because to answer, you have to acknowledge that it's true. An historical accident? Are you kidding me? That answer isn't good enough. That's what you can say to him. You want to deny the validity of predictive prophecy, and you want to deny the Jews' right to the land? Based on what? Whatever answer you give that isn't biblical is wrong. And whatever answer you give like that is not good enough. People like that don't want to believe because they don't want to believe. Simple as that. The evidence for the existence of God is literally overwhelming. It's overwhelming. I could cry right now. And I've done this for a long time. It blows my mind. If you think your problem is insurmountable, I want you to think about these things. Explain to me how this country in 150 years turned from brown and dead to green and living. As I said, the first large-scale Jewish immigration to the land started in the late 19th century, actually 1881. It started. It was in phases. They didn't just all parachute in 1948. They had been coming for a while. And so by the time of statehood in 1948, there were several 100,000 Jews in the land. But this is an example of the people that came back. This is in 1912. Think about that, the year the Titanic sank. these people were reclaiming the land of their forefathers. And a lot of them came because they believed Scripture. They believed God. The famous dry bones chapter, Ezekiel 37, another extraordinary, astonishing declaration by the Lord. Very clear cut. Very clear cut, not ambiguous at all. But what do a lot of churches and pastors do with this? They use it as a sermon illustration to talk about dead, lifeless churches that come back to life somehow. Maybe through Andy Stanley's package on how to grow your church. I don't know. Or fog machines. Or secular music. Or whatever it is. No. Once again, God tells us exactly what He means. If you extrapolate from this that hundreds of years before Christ, the prophet was talking about modern churches, I don't know what to tell you. He says, these are the people of Israel. He says in the chapter, this is the house of Israel. It's not about the church. Now, I'm not saying you can't make a spiritual application. You certainly can. But just don't do it constantly and erase the Jews from the story, because that's what a lot of the aim is as well. It's replacement theology. Where the Old Testament talks about the Jews, God really meant the church. He did? Really? He was talking about the modern American church in the 8th century BC? No, he wasn't. He said there is this vision of these dead, lifeless bones in a valley. What does it mean, prophet? And he has to explain to him, these are your people into the future who return to the land because I do it. I will reclaim you from all the nations where I dispersed you. Isn't that magnificent? Isn't that astonishing? Amen. And he did. 200 nations they came back from, literally all over the world, and they speak one language, Hebrew. Don't tell me there's not a God. Get away from me. Seriously. They speak Hebrew, their ancient language, and they've been in Europe for 2,000 years. They've been in Asia. They've been in Alaska. They've been in Peoria. And now they're Israelis speaking their ancient native tongue. Come on. If that's all you knew, you know enough to find God. Sitting in a hotel a few years ago, my son went with me in 2011. He was 19. I was waiting for him at breakfast. And, because Dad's up at 5:30 in the morning dressed and ready to go. And he came through the door, and as I looked up, I saw another one of those mundane things, just like the houses, I mean, you could see a house in New Orleans, you could see a house in Paris and not think anything about it. But you see a house that Jews live in Israel, you better be thinking about God. So I looked up and I saw, and the exit sign over the door was in Hebrew. Do you know how astonishing that is? That I live in the time when I can visit the Jewish state and their signs are in Hebrew? What do you think is going on? Hebrew is the national language because God decided it would be. Now, there are plenty of critics. One of the worst, and I emphasize the worst, is Brian McLaren. Brian McLaren is a Pied Piper who is leading many people away from God. One of the things that he denies is the specialness of the Jewish people in predictive prophecy. Eschatology is something for him to mock. Bible prophecy people, he mocks. I can tell you for a fact that you can ask him to explain the existence of the Jews today in Israel, and he can't answer. I know that from personal experience. He can't answer because to answer correctly, he would deny his own worldview, which is non-biblical. He has great sway with young people, unfortunately. Speaks on college campuses. Brian McLaren doesn't want to believe in predictive prophecy in the Bible because he doesn't want to. Simple as that. In fact, that in itself is a fulfillment of prophecy. 2 Peter chapter 3, 3 and 4, some of the most remarkable words in all of the Bible. Peter said, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lusts, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of the creation. Now, this is particularly instructive because there's two things going on here. The second half of that verse, where it says they continue as they were from the beginning of creation, first they will deny the creation accounts in Genesis. They're evolutionists. They deny history from Genesis. And once you do that, it's a clear path to denying the end. When you deny the beginning of the Bible, you're going to deny the end. You're also going to deny everything in the middle, which produces a lifeless, dead faith that benefits no one, especially you. So a person who denies Genesis history will deny that Jesus is coming again. And I've heard a lot of these guys do it in a tone so mocking that I fear for them. Now, I want to look at just a few specific examples of predictive prophecy fulfilled. One or two of them are a little more obscure, but no less remarkable. In Zechariah 2, chapter 4, in the book of Zechariah is one of the most amazing prophetic books in the Bible. A lot of big stuff going on related to the last days. It says, Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls for the multitude of men and cattle therein. So it's another vision that the prophet is seeing. And also in this passage, he's seeing a man with a measuring line in Jerusalem. And he's told that they're measuring it because Jerusalem shall be inhabited as towns without walls for the multitude of men and cattle therein. Now, when the prophet wrote this, in ancient times, wherever you had a walled city, it was walled for a reason, for protection. Nobody in their right mind lived outside the old city walls of any city in the world. That was the point of the walls. You know, what's out there at night? Outlaws, wild animals, who knows what. So people were secure in the walls. So for the prophet to predict, think about what he's predicting. Someday, Jerusalem will spill out of its walls because it needs room for all the people. If you read that then or heard it, it would be a little confusing. Why would they do that? Well, God said they would. Okay? That's the point. God said a time would come in the future when Jerusalem would be inhabited outside the walls of the city. In 1860, a wealthy Jewish businessman in London named Moses Montefiore was worried about reports he had heard of the Jewish community in the Old City in Jerusalem, which was riddled with disease, poor nutrition. Jerusalem then was very dirty, very closely compacted. Wasn't a pleasant place to live. It was unhealthy. So he was going to do something bold, and he said, I will provide funds if you will build like apartments outside the city for people to live in and grow and raise their own gardens. It'll elevate people's health, and there was all sorts of benefits. So they did. They did. Now, I was at Jaffa Gate one day reading my Bible, and I was reading Zechariah. And I thought, where was that? And I looked across the way, and on the slopes, which it's now behind what is Yemen Moshe, the neighborhood, just down from the King David Hotel, there's a windmill. So I walked over there, and I stumbled upon Mishkanot Shananim, the beautiful dwelling. This is the place that was built 150 years ago in fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. Think how specific that is. Wasn't that a weird prophecy? They're gonna build places for people to live in outside the walls, and they did. It's an artist colony now. It's writers and painters and people like that. They have symposiums and stuff, renovated to be very beautiful. So I stayed there. And I can tell you, lying in bed at night, looking at the ceiling, thinking about this, blew my mind. God never fails to keep a promise, no matter how obscure it might be. The place is there right now. Anybody can go look. They can walk the grounds, they can read Scripture, and they can choose to believe or not believe. In Amos 9:15 is a lovely verse. And I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land, which I have given them, saith the Lord thy God. In 1967, the Israelis were surrounded on all sides by hostile Arab armies, led by General Nasser in Egypt, who was a really particularly nasty guy. He was another one of these tin-pot dictators who said he was going to wipe Israel off the map. Do these guys not read history? Do they not read history and tremble in their boots? You know how that's gone over down through history? If you pledge that you're going to rid the earth of Jews, you're going to get mashed under the boot heel of history. You're going to be gone. All of them. So he masses 100,000 Egyptian troops on the southern border with Sinai. And the Syrians do the same thing in the north, and everybody else got involved. Jordanians, the Iraqis, the Lebanese. Israel's only friendly neighbor was the Mediterranean Sea. So the Israelis decided they had no choice. And on the morning of June 5th, 1967, they launched a preemptive strike, specifically on the Egyptian Air Force. They knocked out half the Egyptian Air Force in 30 minutes in a surprise attack. 2 days later, in the morning, paratroopers were on the Mount of Olives, looking down at the old city, looking down at the Temple Mount, a scene that a Jewish army had not looked upon in 2,000 years, since the time of the Maccabees. There had not been a sovereign Jewish presence in Jerusalem since then. And every generation of Jews hoped and prayed they would be the ones to liberate the city. So finally, because the Israelis had no plan to do this at the beginning of the week, they were trying to survive. And all of a sudden, victory after victory on the battlefield is just miraculously happening, and they find themselves in this historical moment. So the order came from the government, and then the order came from Central Command. Take the city. So the story goes, and I think it's true, that they made their way to the shortest route, which was the eastern gate, which is walled up. Because in Ezekiel it says only the Messiah will come through that gate at the time of the end. And they were going to blow it open. And some rabbi came running up and he said, "You can't do that. Only the Messiah can go through that gate." So they went around to the other side. They fought their way around the other side, and they went in through Lion's Gate. And in a few minutes, they were raising the Star of David over the Temple Mount, where it still flies 50 years later. It's the IDF troops running up steps towards the Dome of the Rock. In June, I had to go for other reasons. And when I looked at the calendar, I thought, wow, I'm going to be there on the 50th anniversary of the retaking the city. So at 10:30 in the morning, I walked through Lion's Gate. And it blew my mind. God promised over and over and over that one day, at the time of his choosing, he would return his people to their land. And they would be sovereign in their ancient capital again. You notice, he said they'll never be uprooted from their land again. The older I get, the less I worry about anything. But something I never worry about is Israel, which runs counter to the prevailing view that they're in danger. My Israeli friends, to some degree, think I'm crazy. Even my Christian friends think I'm crazy. You can worry about a lot of things, but don't worry about Israel's safety. What did he say? He said, "I'm going to plant you in your land again, and you will never be uprooted again." Can the State Department change that? Can the PLO change it? Nasser couldn't change it. 3 years after the Six-Day War, which he lost in dramatic fashion, he dropped dead of a heart attack. Assad in Syria threatened Israel for 35 years. He was on the phone one day in 2000 talking to Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. He dropped dead. He's gone. The Israeli flag still flies over Jerusalem. If he said they're never going to be uprooted again, then stop worrying about what's going to happen in the West Bank. I have an Israeli friend who's highly placed, and he laughed one day when we were talking about that, and he said, "Jim, there's approaching 500,000 of us now in Judea and Samaria. They're not going anywhere." And they won't. AD 70 came the destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman 10th Legion. The Jewish historian Josephus was there to record it. He saw it. It was said that the Roman soldiers were in such a frenzy over their Jew hatred that they literally pulled down every stone from the temple. remember what Jesus told the apostles in Matthew 24? He said they were looking at the temple, and they were asking him, when is the time of the end? And one of the things he said was, the temple is going to be destroyed, and not one stone will be left upon another. Not one. You know, you can stand on the Temple Mount today, and in your mind's eye, think about it then, because there was no Dome of the Rock, there was no Al-Aqsa Mosque, there was no outbuildings. The Roman 10th Legion scraped it flat as a tabletop. And today you can go to the Western Wall and you can look to your right and you can see the foundation stones of the temple are still at the bottom of the wall where the Romans pushed them over. It was flat as a tabletop. This picture I took one night, Jonathan and I, we had gone to dinner in a Moroccan restaurant in the old city. And you know, here, if you go to a restaurant that's 100 years old, that's really impressive. This thing was a former Crusader stronghold. So anyway, I said, let's walk through the Jewish quarter tonight. And so we did, and as we were walking through, once again, the enormity of what you're looking at just washed over me. And I said, listen, we looked at these pillars. So here is the evidence of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, which led to the expulsion, the final expulsion of the Jewish people from the land. We're surrounded by apartment buildings and businesses owned by Jews, and the windows were open that night, and you could hear them laughing and singing and playing music. Yes, God keeps His promises. And through the keeping of His promises proves to us that He's real. Not just real, but interested in you as an individual. If this is a friend of mine who lives over there has a theory, it's called the this is that thing, this is that theory. And he said, if this is true over here in the Bible, then that is also true. Right? And it is. If the creation accounts are true, then Jesus came to die on the cross and was resurrected after 3 days. So think of it this way, if you need to. If those things are true, then when Jesus says in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who are burdened and weary, and I will give you rest, He will do it. He set the stage of history in the most spectacular way possible by bringing back an entire people after a 2,000-year dispersion. He can handle your problems. Relationship, finances, job loss, whatever it is, when you come to the time at night, when you're in bed alone and you're looking at the ceiling trying to figure out your problems, I want you to think about this. You live in the moment when the Jews re-entered history. These are the temple ruins. I took a picture. This is the area where the stones from the temple are pushed over. This is a Jewish family looking at the archaeological park. Here are the stones, another version. Now, status of Jerusalem. Bill and I have talked about this. Nobody in the world cared anything about who controlled Jerusalem until 1967. Forever, nobody cared. Never the ancient capital of any civilization, no conquering army set up capital there. Nobody cared. It was a backwater that nobody was interested in, except the Jewish people. During the 2,000-year dispersion, every single day the Jew would pray next year in Jerusalem. They hoped they would be the generation to reclaim the city. So in 1967, when the Israeli paratroopers took control of the city, and the Jordanians lost it, you know, Israel told King Hussein through private channels, just stay out of it. You know, our fight is not with you. Leave it alone. But he was too afraid of the alliance that he'd signed with Nasser, so he orders the Jordanian League to hold the city and fight to the death. He lost it all. In a morning, he lost it all. Forever. So, this picture of the Dome of the Rock, those are actual gold plates, beaten gold sheets. In the latter chapters of Zechariah, God says that there will be a final climactic battle for the city. And he said all the nations will come against Jerusalem. I asked a Hebrew scholar over there one time, I said, what does that word all mean in Hebrew? And he said, it means all. You know, the reason that's important is because the critics, and I'm talking about critics in the church, they'll say, well, you see, that was really talking about the Assyrian invasion and blah, blah, blah. No, it wasn't, because that wasn't all the nations of the earth. There would come a remarkable moment when all of the international community would come against Jerusalem. Why? Why? Only one reason, because the Jews control it, and that they can't abide. Their Jew hatred prevents them from letting the status quo continue. And so there's going to be a battle one day for that city. I personally believe, and I'm not dogmatic about a lot of end-time stuff, I won't fight about dating and that kind of thing. But there has to be a trigger for those great prophecies to be fulfilled. And what would it be? Well, it'd be the present condition. The PLO, the other Islamic states in the region, they will never rest so long as there's a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. The city is technically open, but if you go there, the Palestinians want what they call East Jerusalem. The imaginary dividing line is just about at Jaffa Gate on the western side of the city. That faces Jewish Jerusalem, which is a sprawling metropolis. The Palestinians want the old city, including the Temple Mount, for their capital. That's the area, Silwan, a village. To the north is Nablus Road. The American Colony Hotel is there. That kind of thing. They want that for a capital. Now, in reality, they want all of it. You know, you can buy a t-shirt in the Arab quarter in the old city, and it'll have a picture of Palestine, and it's all Arabic. There is no Israel. They're telling you exactly, right out front, what they're about. They don't want a capital in East Jerusalem. They want all of it. They want the land from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, free of Jews. Well, guess what? One verse in Isaiah, in Amos, refutes that. Just one. The status of Jerusalem is going to be the trigger. And all of this talk about a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, all that kind of stuff, that's setting the stage. When it happens, I can't say. But isn't it amazing that we live in this time? Trump recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and 176 nations call for a Palestinian state. There were a few brave souls that didn't, including Romania. Wow. American prestige and leadership is not dead in the world. When America leads, other people follow. Romania used to be Israel's mortal enemy, in league with the Soviets. And today they recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. God bless the Romanians. These are the generations. In Israel, everything is swirling together. The past, the present, and the future, you can feel it as you walk down the street. It's all swirling together. Everything is connected, and these people are very much connected to their ancient homeland. On the left is a famous, famous picture of 3 Israeli generals walking through Lion's Gate that morning that they took the old city in the Six-Day War. Uzi Narkis, Moshe Dayan, famous black eye patch in the middle, and Yitzhak Rabin, who would one day be prime minister. On the right are their 3 grandchildren walking through Lion's Gate in June of 2017. They're still there. And they're not going anywhere. When people threaten the Jews in Israel, oh, please, come on. I have never worried about the Iranian threats against Israel. You know, they're gonna wipe Israel off the map with nukes. You know who's in trouble? Iran. Not Israel. God said one people would be preserved forever. And I'm going to wrap up here. This is the American Colony Hotel Courtyard, a famous place for people to drink coffee and talk. A lot of people from the city gather there, political people, religious leaders. And one day I was having coffee with a retired Israeli officer, IDF officer. And, you know, nice guy, and he knew I was an evangelical Christian. And so we talked about a lot of things. We talked about politics and the IDF and stuff. And finally I thought, you know what, I can ask this guy what he thinks of this. And so I did. And I said, you know, I'm a Christian. He said, yeah. I said, in Zechariah, there's that weird description of that battle for Jerusalem where it says that people's eyes will melt out of their sockets and their tongues will melt out of their mouths. I said, what do you think that means? And he looked away. He's a secular guy. And he looked away, and then he looked back and he said, it's describing a nuclear strike, if one believes the Bible is true. Isn't that interesting? That's exactly what it's describing. There will be some kind of nuclear confrontation for that city. The Israelis already are in possession of battlefield nukes like we are. So that is going to happen. In Isaiah, after God tells the people in Zechariah that he's going to fight for them as he did in the ancient times, in Isaiah he says, I'm going to feed your enemies their own flesh. Israel's not in trouble today. Zechariah 14:14, and Judah shall fight at Jerusalem. The IDF will be there. This is a photograph. I love this picture. This is the older brother of the prime minister. This is Jonathan Netanyahu, the commander of their elite counterterrorism unit, the Syriat Matkal, the unit. They're like our Delta Force. He's sitting on Mount Hermon in October 1973 after a battle with Syrian commandos. My faith first is in God, but I have a lot of faith in the IDF. A lot. The Israel Defense Forces will take care of business when the time comes. So Israel is reborn. You live in the moment in history when the Jews re-entered history. And so, to conclude, the existence of the modern state of Israel is living proof that Bible prophecy is true. And if that's all you know, you can know God. You can know the God of the Bible and know that He knows you. And then in those moments when you're afraid, and you ask Him, you tell Him that you must have relief because you're burdened and weary and you have no other out, He will come to you. Guaranteed. Thank you.